Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. We are really excited for the opportunity to host you today to talk about a very interesting topic and one that is incredibly relevant to these times in which so much of our lives, both personally and professionally, has been impacted by the pandemic. The conversation today is going to be about change, diversity of thought, and how we can leverage many of the tools around us to become that change agent that our organizations and the world needs us to be. I'm going to be joined by an incredible speaker who will walk us through many of her life experiences, pushing for and driving change in one of the most established, and I'd say change-resistant organizations in the world. I could not be more excited about what we will learn from her today. And towards the end of the webinar, I'll spend some time talking about identity, the role that digital identity is rising up to play in a remote-first world, and how we, as IT professionals, can use identity to drive change in our organizations and help them evolve and adapt to meet the challenges that the pandemic and many other forces in business and technology are pushing for. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items. We do want to hear from you. This is meant to be a dynamic conversation. Please pop up your questions into the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we'll and keep them coming. We will do our best to answer them at the end of this presentation. And if we don't have time to go through each and every single one of them, we will make sure to follow up offline. And you can also engage with us and also fellow attendees via chat. I'll be your host today. My name is Lance Malacara. I'm a product marketer here at Okta. I've been with the company for about a year now. I joined about this time in 2021, joined in the middle of the pandemic. And like many of us, there's probably a few of you in the audience who, like me, joined a new company through the pandemic and have been working remotely from the very beginning. In my case, to this day, I still haven't been able to meet many of my colleagues from Okta in person, which is something that actually troubles me. I'm a very social person. I get my energy from being around people. But this is the reality in which we have had to live for the past 22-ish months. And we have had to adapt to change. And even though it's been hard, it's also been a very rewarding experience for myself. The reason I share all of this is because change is a key topic in our conversation today. And I want to start warming up, getting us all into that mindset of change and thinking not only about how to manage change, but how to be drivers of change. And also, very importantly, thinking about why change is important in all aspects of our lives. And before I go any further, let me introduce our guest speaker for today. I'm very excited to be joined by Carmen Medina. Carmen is a retired senior federal executive with 32 years of experience in the intelligence community, and is recognized as a national and an international expert on intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, diversity of thought and innovation, and entrepreneurship in the public sector. Without further ado, Carmen, I'll hand things over to you. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and excited to have you with us today.
Lance, thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning / afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks to Okta for the opportunity to share some of my stories about leading significant IT change efforts at the CIA. As Lance mentioned, I spent 32 years at CIA, and my career, I like to say, went from typewriter to Twitter. I pretty much saw the entire technology revolution during my time at CIA. And in fact, the various attempts to implement new IT systems was the constant drumbeat of my career in the federal government. So I learned a lot of lessons, and I have a few scars. So what I'd like to do actually is share some of those lessons with you and talk about what I learned managing IT transitions at CIA. And what I will say is that the first 10, 15 years of my career at CIA, I started in 1978, truly still the age of typewriters. I did not have any concern at all about the CIA's business model, although I actually don't think the phrase business model was in common use back then. And I thought that the mission that we had of providing intelligence to national security policymakers was a unique one, and that we were uniquely positioned to do it. But by the late 1980s, I began to see these changes in the external environment that really suggested to me that some attention needed to be paid to how the CIA was doing things. In the before times, when we could do this in a live setting, I would try to have the audience guess what some of those changes were that I saw. And a lot of people talk about things like the end of the Cold War, and the Cold War was ending then, but that's not exactly it. Or the rise of the internet, although the internet really hadn't risen yet. But the rise of the internet gets you close to one of them, which is the very first examples of digital technology that I saw enter the workplace. And for me, the one that was game-changing was a secure fax machine. Yes, fax machine, mid to late 80s, these giant behemoths that were 3 times the size of refrigerators. And we could put a piece of paper into that secure fax machine, and it would appear in the White House Situation Room 10 seconds later. And I was thinking, that's a tremendous change, and it calls into question why we are still operating in the once-a-day newspaper model, because that's what the CIA did. It provided its information in the morning to busy policymakers around town. Another one that people almost never guess, that change in the environment that I thought was really important and spoke to the need for change, was the rise of cable news networks. They didn't emerge actually until the 1980s. CNN was the first one. And I started listening to the content that these cable news networks provided. And I realized that there was about a 75% overlap between what the CIA wanted to tell policymakers and what the cable news networks was telling policymakers, but they did it faster and in a more compelling way. And so that got me to thinking as well that we really need to change the way we do our business. And my question to all of you in the audience is, given the rate of change that is occurring in the environment around you right now, incredibly, as Lance pointed out, accelerated by this COVID pandemic, if you think about the rate of change outside your organization, what percentage of what your organization does on a day in and day out basis has to change every year to keep pace with the rate of change in the outside world, in that world beyond your company? Now, usually when I ask these questions of organizations, I often get a reaction that seems to indicate to me that people had not previously asked themselves this question. We know change is a constant. We know the externalities are changing at a particular rate, and we presume that we have to change in some ways to keep up with that. So what percentage of what you do has to change every year? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? What percentage of what you did changed during COVID? I bet it's a really high percentage number. And my point on this is that all organizations have to anticipate and get ahead of the need for change rather than simply be reacting to it. So in any case, by the mid-1990s, I was ringing the bell, arguing that the CIA needed to start thinking about how it was going to make its transition to the digital age. CIA is basically a knowledge organization. Our job was to provide information to busy policymakers. And I thought that the internet and digital technologies were going to change the way all knowledge organizations worked. And I, was considered a fairly competent employee. And I started sharing this message. And to my surprise, nobody really paid attention to my message. And worse, if they did pay attention, they thought I was crazy. And for a long time, I couldn't quite figure out why my message that we needed to make significant change and adapt to the digital revolution wasn't resonating at the CIA. And it was only, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, sometime later that I realized the mistake that I was making. At that point in the internet age, it was all about open information and open access and transparency. What was the CIA about? None of those things. The CIA was about secrecy and holding on to information to retain power. And so what I didn't really think through at the time, and only now really understand in retrospect, is that moving forward with digital technology and the internet really challenged almost all of the CIA's working assumptions. So what I want to share with you are a few of the lessons that I learned while trying to help the CIA make this transition. So the first one I've already talked about, which is that theological change is hard, right? What I was arguing for, the value of the internet to knowledge organizations, worked for a lot of other organizations, but it didn't work for CIA. It was counter to everything that the CIA stood for. And when you as a change agent are advocating for theological change, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, because sometimes the issue is, yes, that important that you need to take it on, but you have to realize it's going to be really difficult. And the first thing you need to do, you need to think about the change that you're proposing is whether or not it is theological in nature. Now, it turned out that I went to several sessions back then because all of private industry was trying to deal with the internet as well. And I remember one event that I went to was the Global Business Network in the late 1990s. And I was approached by a woman who worked for a large multinational who came to me and said, "Carmen, I can tell that you're a heretic at CIA." And I was just taken aback because I had never had anybody, and I had certainly never thought of myself as a heretic. But she nailed it. And she said, "You're a heretic at CIA, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And for you to survive this experience as a change agent, you're going to have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it is, in fact, that level of discomfort that tells you that you're actually doing something, right? That you're actually trying to move that idea forward." I spent several years, I guess, in the wasteland because my people reacted badly to my ideas, and they thought I was cynical and negative, which I'm not. I don't think so as an individual. But finally, I was able to make some progress with these ideas. And I made that progress when I realized that to advance these ideas, I had to find some area where the internet and digital technologies overlapped with values that the CIA already had. And if we could marry these two things, if they could see how digital technologies and the internet could actually help advance some CIA values, then perhaps I'd be able to make some progress. And that's exactly what happened. During that time, the CIA was having horrible problem with information leaking all over the place. And the way, as I mentioned, that we delivered our information was, in a newspaper type format. It was delivered at 5 o'clock in the morning around Washington with, by men driving around in vans. And the joke was that, often the information would be taken by people who shouldn't be receiving it, copied and leaked to the press, for example. And the joke was that you could read your CIA information quicker by reading the Washington Post rather than waiting for the CIA to deliver it. And so a position was created to try to help secure our classified information in a more reliable way. And although security aspects were not really what my area of specialization at CIA, luckily I realized that if I could advance the idea that digital technologies would allow us to eliminate that paper trail, eliminate the trips to the copying machine, and that we could actually make our information sharing more secure through digital technology, then I would actually be approaching my idea through an adjacency, through something that the CIA already believed in and supported. And luckily, that's exactly what happened. By making the case and showing that digital technologies could improve something that the CIA cared about, eventually I was given the opportunity to move the CIA forward in digital content delivery. Now, I didn't do it myself, that's for sure. But I didn't, at the beginning, do a good job at getting other people to support my idea. At the time, I think I was really too much about my own ego and not enough about making my idea community property. So when you're a change agent in an organization, I would suggest to you your very first priority is to make your idea somebody else's idea. And this illustration with some of the people falling out the back of the bus is points out a nuance of this gaining supporters. You don't just have to gain them, you have to keep them. And that often means that you're going to have to pump the brakes once in a while on some of your change ideas, on your vision, for example, because you need to move at a rate that all your followers or most of your followers can tolerate. So gaining and keeping allies is very important for change agents trying to make these IT changes to benefit their company. And the last of these big lessons that I learned at being a change agent at CIA was that practical things really matter, and God truly is in the details. When I was finally making progress in pushing out digital content, and this was like the late 1990s, one day the CIA security officer darkened my door and told me that, Carmen, you had a problem. What I didn't realize then was what we all know now, is that Microsoft Word documents carry with them revision histories. So what we're doing is tailoring content for policymakers based on their clearances and deleting things that they were not cleared to read. And what we didn't realize is that they could read everything they wanted if they knew how to manipulate revision history. And I recognized right away this was a huge problem. But I had never really talked to the one woman at the agency who was an expert in document control. Her name was Hope. And I had assumed that she was a bureaucratic black belt, and that she wouldn't be interested in these visionary ideas. And I was completely wrong. In fact, Hope ended up being the person who not only solved this problem for me in document control and digital identity, but she had all these other ideas and knowledge that really helped advance and move our project forward. So those are kind of the big takeaways I had about surviving and prospering as a change agent. And a lot of them, not all of them, sadly, I learned in real time. A lot of them, I learned them after the fact. There's a few other things I could talk about in terms of when you've actually gotten people to give you the okay to move forward. Then, what are some of the lessons that I learned in terms of implementing your change program? Well, as I illustrated with that story about revisions in Word documents, surprise is inevitable. It's guaranteed, no matter how well you try to plan out your change activity, that there will be some things that you don't anticipate. And so you have to build in, I think, enough flexibility, particularly in terms of your scheduling, to allow and to accommodate these surprises. It's very important to really nail the practical parts of what you're trying to do. One of the mistakes that change agents often make is that they just keep talking about their vision because it's really pleasant to talk about this beautiful end state, and don't spend enough time talking about how we get there, how the organization gets there. the fact of the matter is that most people in your organization, when asked, would probably agree with the end state you're painting, but they are very unhappy about all the mess that's going to be caused and the discombobulation in trying to move the organization there. So, big practical piece of advice for change agents: spend less time talking about your vision and more time talking to bureaucratic belts and nailing down the practical issues, the details. Timing is everything when you're trying to make change. You know, there is one of my favorite sayings, and I don't know if anyone ever actually said it, is that there is nothing so weak as an idea whose time has not yet come. And I think the really good example of that is what's happened to organizations during COVID, right? A lot of the things that organizations and a lot of the ways that work has had to modify itself have been talked about for a really long time, but there was just not enough pressure building in the system to force organizations who don't like to change to seriously move forward with these ideas. Timing was everything, though. COVID comes along, all the issues with maintaining physical work presence manifest, and all of a sudden, yes, we can move forward with ideas that otherwise we would have taken a long time to implement. So timing truly is everything on these ideas. And as I alluded to when I talked about my friend Hope, the bureaucratic black belt, that if you really want to move forward in a compelling and effective way with your change ideas, and in fact, with anything that you do in organizations, your best insurance policy is to have diversity of thought on the teams doing the work. I spent a lot of time, particularly toward the end of my last 5 or 10 years of my CIA career, contemplating a lot about what it is that makes for a good thought, because that's what we're in the business of, is generating really insightful observations about what's going on in the world. And I realized that we all have different strengths. We bring different strengths to how we do our work. And there are different cognitive styles that we have to incorporate into our work team so that they can be as effective as possible. So one of the reasons I think that this is really compelling is a phenomenon known as the streetlight effect. So what is the streetlight effect? The streetlight effect is based on, at least the name is based on a joke that a policeman comes across a man on his hands and knees on the ground looking for something under a streetlight. And the policeman asks the man, you know, what are you doing? And the man says, I lost my car keys. And the policeman says, is this where you lost them? And the man on the ground says, no, but it's the only place I can see. Okay, so what does this have to do with organizations, particularly those in knowledge work? And frankly, we're all in knowledge work, right? We often make decisions in our organizations with this assumption that we actually know all the information that we need to know to make that decision. And I have to confess, it was quite late in my CI career when I realized, and it was like an epiphany, that all this information that enters my inbox, I treat it as if it accurately reflects reality. And yet, it doesn't accurately reflect reality. It is only some sliver of the information that would represent reality. And not only does it not accurately represent reality, I don't know how off it is. I have no way of knowing whether I know 10% of what I should know about Al-Qaeda or 40% of what I should know about Al-Qaeda. And this blindness that you have, this inability to know ahead of time whether or not you have all the information that you need to make a decision, that is I think one of the most pernicious and difficult problems that all organizations face. So what can you do about, how can you combat this issue? And this is where I turn to another kind of aha moment in my CI career, is that our ability, any of us, our ability to know anything is always a function of our tools for knowing. So in the history of cosmology, the big event after the Big Bang was the realization of humans that we were not the center of the universe. And the person in popular literature who's given credit for that discovery is Galileo, Copernicus first, and then Galileo. Everyone thinks that Galileo must have been a brilliant man, and he may have been a brilliant man, but even more important, he was the best telescope maker in Italy. It was his ability to manipulate telescopes and see the world or the solar system more clearly, which gave him that insight about our galaxy and our solar system. So we all need to reflect on what are the tools, the processes that we use to acquire information, to understand, however incompletely we do understand reality, and recognize that somewhere along the way, another tool is going to emerge that is going to give us better insight. And I think one of the really interesting things about tools is that despite all this work on computers and software, the human brain remains the best tool we have for knowing. Our ability to pattern detect and the speed with which our brain can do things is still not matched by artificial intelligence or deep machine learning, which is why I think that the best way for you to sharpen your ability and increase your ability to understand the world is to have more brains on your team, and not just more brains of the same type, but to try, and this is incomplete, we still don't really understand this. I think this is the future of talent management, if you ask me, that understanding the different types of skills that make for a superior team, I think that would be a really powerful thing. And so, but to the best of our ability, we have to look for different thinkers and put them together to tackle our difficult problems. Now, I said earlier when I was talking about being a change agent, that if you're a change agent, you can't just talk about your vision, you have to talk about practical things as well. And so let me give you, in closing, some practical ideas about how to not only have diversity of thought on your team, but actually harvest it, actually take advantage of it. And I think that's very difficult for organizations. A lot of organizations say they want diversity of thought, but at the same time, they value organizational smoothness, people not rocking the boat. And it makes sense because they want to deliver value at scale, and that's hard to do without consistency. But all those things that you say to indicate that keeping things running smoothly is a priority for your organization has a dampening effect on people actually giving you their good ideas, on actually making use, deploying diversity of thought. So I've had this slide up here for a couple of minutes, so you all presumably have had a chance to look at them and ask yourself, what's wrong with these phrases? And I've picked them out. They're very common phrases you hear all the time in business meetings. You know, people say any comments or questions and so forth and so on. And lots of people like to say that they make decisions through consensus. And I think, obviously I wouldn't have them up there if I didn't think that each one of these phrases is problematic if you use them, if you also want to have deploy diversity of thought to solve your problems. So let me show you, and then I'll talk about it, what I think is the problem with these phrases. So first, the alternative. There's a meeting, and we're going to do it at the end of this meeting because we want your questions, right? There's a meeting, and the person running the meeting ends it and then says, any comments or questions? And what do you hear is crickets, right? So what's a better, in fact, what does the phrase, any comments or questions, indicate? Oh, the meeting's about to end. That's bad. So what kinds of questions could you ask that would be more specific, more encouraging to your team? What did I get wrong? How would you do it differently? What did I miss? I just read a really interesting article just the other week about the impact, the difference in using the word something or anything. Is there anything more? It's kind of open-ended, but if you ask, is there something more I could do for you, that's more inviting in terms of someone volunteering something. Don't bring me problems without solutions. Okay, it just makes no sense. The person who sees the problem is also responsible for providing the solution. Don't we have a team? Can't we work on this together? You're a NASA scientist. You see the comet heading to Earth, but you don't say anything because you don't know what to do about it, right? I mean, to me, it's nonsensical. I have an open door policy. Golly, I'm sure I used to say that as well. And it's not particularly that it's horrible, but, and I say this in a kind of joking way, if you have to say you have an open door policy, you probably don't have one. So you should, as a leader, you should conduct yourself in such a way that it's just second nature for people to know that you're open to whatever they have to say. If you have to use that phrase too often, there's something wrong with your actions and that speak louder than words. That's complicated. Let's take it offline. You'll say that in the meeting and you're honest. It is complicated, right? But when you say it, if you don't follow it up immediately with, well, let's see if we can schedule the meeting right now, or, immediately after this meeting. If you don't do something to indicate to the other people that you really are taking the idea seriously, they're going to think that you've just blown this person off. And perhaps my favorite, let's reach consensus, right? People say, I make decisions through consensus. This is how I view this. Decision-making implies choosing among options. If you don't choose among options, you're not making a decision. You're actually just kind of kicking the can down the road and settling for the lowest common denominator. So when you say that I decide things by consensus, you're also telling people that there's a really high bar for you to have an objection to something that everyone has agreed to. So you're dampening dissent. I would say there's one process that every team has to have agreement on, and that's the process by which we settle disagreements. That's the key process that you have to agree on. And people have to sort of know, okay, for example, I may not completely support every idea, but I have to be able to live with every idea. However you solve that will be different for every team, but you have to have some kind of way of constructively dealing with disagreement, or you will not effectively deploy diversity of thought. After all, diversity of thought means that there are going to be disagreements. So those are my lessons that I learned about being a change agent at CIA. That's my Twitter handle if anybody ever wants to follow me, because I do share frequently on topics such as these. Again, thanks to Okta and all of you for listening. And Lance, over to you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. That was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your learnings and your life experiences with us. I personally feel like I can relate to a lot of the situations that you just described. And I'm sure, many of the folks in the audience can actually also relate, in their own context and in their own reality to some of these challenges that we see. And, as IT professionals, we're constantly challenged to, thinking about the future, thinking about how technology is impacting, our organization, the way we work. And we are constantly facing that question, is this technology the change driver that we need to implement? Is it not? How do you make that decision? Is something that is a constant question, for many of us, and I'm sure for many of the people in the audience. So thank you so much for that. hang tight. I'm gonna spend some time now walking our audience through, just the concept of reimagining the role of identity. As I was saying, different technologies play different roles for an organization. And I think in the context of this conversation, in the context of change, I want to spend a few minutes just walking through, how identity has changed, over the years, and what is the role that identity can and should play for organizations and for people, in general, in this, during these times and into the future. And I also want to you to stick around for a bit. Towards the end, we'll open it up for questions from the audience, so we can talk about and answer some of those questions together. So in the context of reimagining identity, I always like to start with this illustration, this meme, if you will. I know it's pretty funny. You've probably all seen it already. It became very popular, as almost from the beginning of the pandemic, and just last week, some colleagues continued to send it to me. That's why I thought, to add it to this presentation here. But it really ties back nicely to, one of the things that Carmen said in the beginning of this presentation. How much of the change that you push and that you work for to drive in your organization is motivated by internal decisions, internal principles, or how much of it is actually, happening or being pushed from the outside world, from beyond your organization. And I think this was clearly the case for many of us, when the pandemic hit back in 2020. We were all caught by surprise. A pandemic of this magnitude had not happened for a century in the world, and it really all caught us by surprise, and we had to react to it in ways that we were not necessarily expecting. And it's pointing to one of the concepts that we often speak to here at Okta, which is the idea or the concept of ludicrous speed. If you work in IT and security, you know that the pace of innovation is just staggering. This is not new to anyone in the audience, and if you've been around for a while, you are probably really used to working on one of the fastest changing environments that exists out there. It actually requires a special skill. Not everyone is used to the pace of transformation that you have seen, that the people that work in IT are seeing and that have seen for the last 2-ish decades, I'd say, or even more than that. However, to the illustration just before, the last 2 decades might now seem just a walk in the park for you, compared to the last 2 years. The pandemic has actually brought about just the most radical change in business, but more specifically to the technology that is now required to not support the business, but to actually drive and enable the business model in any organization. It is what we at Okta, now call ludicrous speed. That is when light speed is just too slow. And I think many of the people in the audience can relate to this concept. So just as a matter of reference, to illustrate this point, take a look at some of the indicators that support this claim that the technology is now moving at ludicrous speed. It's estimated that the global pandemic has brought about more than 7 years worth of digital transformation in business and technology all around. From demanding businesses to move employees to work from home almost overnight, to supporting customers' growing demand for products and services that can be purchased online, and everything in between. And it's not only the astonishing pace of digital innovation and transformation that we're seeing, it is also almost ridiculous. It's the almost ridiculous speed at which it needs to be implemented. Let me put that into context. Take a look at this slide. In 2020, this is a slide about a study that McKinsey actually ran, a survey that McKinsey ran in 2020 among IT and security professionals, asking them to share some of their war stories, some of these hero type efforts to support the sudden change that their company is required to go through to mainly remain operational, in the context of the onset of the pandemic. And they also asked them to compare the amount of time that they had to execute some of these initiatives at the onset of the pandemic relative to the expected time they would have taken if the company had the time to plan the change, ahead of time. And these numbers are incredible to me. Just take a look at some of these numbers that we're seeing on the screen right now. Just remote work is probably the most staggering of them all, but our customers at Okta, came to us and told us if I had the time to plan and implement, a change of this magnitude, a change in which I would actually send all of my employees to work remotely from home or anywhere else, it would have taken probably a year and a half, if not more than that. We actually had to execute that in just 10 days, on average. Same with many other aspects in this slide, that are relevant to IT. If we were to adapt to a completely online transaction model, how much time would it have taken if we had planned ahead of it? More than a year and a half, almost 2 years, 585 days, compared to how much time we actually had to implement a change like this, which is in this case just 21 days. An acceleration factor of 27x, which is just staggering and unbelievable. Migrating assets to the cloud, same thing. For just under a couple of years to under a month. And also spending and our investments and our strategy in data security, rolling out a data security project, which is so high stakes and so sensitive for organizations these days. They take almost 2 years, if not more than that, to plan for it. They had to implement some of this in less than a month as well. This is just to illustrate, this concept of staggering pace in which technology is impacting the way we do business. For technology itself and for the many changes that we're seeing around the world. And the most astonishing takeaway from this study from McKinsey, in my opinion, is that 54% of IT executives surveyed actually believe that this pace of change will not slow down in the foreseeable future. So I want to spend the next few minutes walking through 3 broad opportunities or opportunity areas across security, IT modernization, and digital experiences, and the way that identity can actually help your organization get to the next level. The first one is dynamic work. Dynamic work is not just enabling remote work, the way we had to during the pandemic, but it's about preparing for the future of work, whether it's remote, it's in the office, or anywhere else. Now more than ever, people are using technology to work from anywhere in the world. It's what's come to be known as digital nomads. The point here is that IT now has to bridge the digital and the physical worlds for a more seamless and adaptive workforce in the long run. And there are a range of things that we can actually think about from an IT perspective that we can do to actually enable a seamless transition to remote work. First and foremost, it's thinking holistically about this never-ending challenge of enabling people to be their most productive, right? Regardless of how much the world is changing around them. Think about the last couple of years. Did your company just turn on remote work, or do you actually have a remote work strategy? A remote work strategy may very well mean, having this mindset switch to be people-oriented rather than technology-oriented, people-focused. It means striving to understand how your users are actually using the technology that they need to get their jobs done and to collaborate, and whether your IT strategies are actually making them productive, or are they just becoming yet another process? If the pandemic showed us something, is that people will find a way to use any technology that they need to be productive, regardless of whether it's sanctioned by IT or not. Another concept in the context of dynamic work is optimizing for remote support. Now more than ever, organizations need to build flexibility, but also they need to build empathy into the support structures that enable dynamic work. Again, it's about the people more than ever. Enabling people, not technology, is a new paradigm in IT. Think about the concept of hiring now remotely. Think about as HR teams are now thinking about or reimagining hiring to be able to get access to talent anywhere in the world, all over the world, instead of concentrating talent on a specific location. How are you going to support it from an IT perspective? And it's also about streamlining the employee experience, the employee life cycle. Employees will join, move around, and leave your organizations, even through the pandemic. As it's been the case for myself. I haven't been able to meet a lot of people in person. And we've seen cases in which people actually join, move within, and leave a company in a remote fashion. How do you keep tabs on that in an efficient way? Some quick wins, quick ideas here could include automating onboarding and offboarding processes using identity. The idea of customizing employee experiences based on who they are rather than on what they work. It's a significant mindset shift that we need to start thinking a lot about. It actually decreases security risks from human errors and increases productivity between groups. And when you think about the long-term opportunity of dynamic work, I love a quote that I heard from one of our customers, a CISO of one of our most prominent customers here at Okta. He said, identity management, when done right, is not an IT service like granting access, responding to service desks, resetting passwords, but rather identity management is a foundation. Like, how do I enable anyone in my organization to access any technology easily and securely? And that's a kind of mindset switch that I want us to think about. Think for example about the concept of zero trust. The corporate security perimeter no longer exists, and the world is getting more complex. How do you protect the network when no one is on the same network anymore? Zero trust is about delivering productivity and security with the least friction possible. It means getting the right people access to the right technology, the right level of access to the right technology, to the right resources in the right context at the right time, and assessing that continuously. And that's something that can only be done through identity. Just a couple of things to think about. And an interesting example of a company that we, as we call them here at Okta, an identity-first company, FedEx, they realized their transition to remote work in a very efficient way, working closely with us. They actually had already started, or decided to move to Okta for identity. But at the onset of the pandemic, in the middle of a phased project, they needed to accelerate deployment timelines of Okta to enable remote work for its entire workforce. It actually took them 36 hours to move mission-critical applications to Okta, enabling over 340,000 employees of all types, from office workers, knowledge workers, to service agents, drivers, etc., to access their work remotely via Okta. And now FedEx is positioned to be decommissioning all legacy identity solutions, consolidating over more than 250 applications, both in homegrown build, based in the cloud, on-premises, and SaaS consumed, into a single identity service that supports a zero trust strategy. The second opportunity I want to talk about is IT consolidation. Lots of customers made purchasing decisions based on short-term needs and assumptions about how the pandemic would progress back in 2020 and 2021. The pandemic also had defied all IT leader expectations on implementation timelines. As I said, as we saw in the chart below, reducing the time to get to deploy and implement the technology from multiple years to only a couple of days. Many of these IT leaders, had to respond to challenges in managing data security, migration of assets to the cloud, advanced technologies in decision-making, and implementation needed to happen very, very quickly. So identity can be a leverage to help us consolidate all of these different technologies and move faster and respond to the market needs faster and in a more efficient way. In the long term, identity can be a lever that helps companies consolidate distributed environments. As companies move to the cloud, which is happening, companies are moving workloads to the cloud faster than ever. The reality, though, is that that not all of these assets will necessarily go to the cloud, at least not in the foreseeable future. There are many different reasons why companies are still interested in keeping some of these workloads, closer to heart, closer to home, on premises. And a unifying it into a single identity strategy can mean, you optimize for people rather than the technology, which means that not everything needs to roll up to the cloud. It means having a single view of your data so that you can choose where to best execute it, whether it's in the cloud, on premises, or at the edge. It's your choice, and it's about enabling people, not enabling the technology. And I think that's another mindset switch that I want the audience to take away from today. A good real life example of IT consolidation is Experian. They started as a credit reporting agency and have since transformed into a direct-to-consumer technology company focused on data and data-driven experiences. At the core of what Experian does, it's the need to secure its customers' information every step of the way. It's a very critical function and a very critical task for them. And they think about identity as a foundation for that mission. In securing its customers' data, Experian actually looks for flexibility to handle a broad mix of internal applications, as well as the growing portfolio of customers and partner-facing applications. They were able to replace 6 disparate IAM solutions or IAM technologies with just one, which resulted in a significantly better security posture. And if that wasn't enough, it delivered almost $9 million in cost savings. And they achieved this for 16,000 employees, customers, and partners in just under 1 year. And finally, I want to speak about the last and third opportunity of change with identity, which is customer-centric digital experiences. IT organizations are actually shifting from a yes, you can do that, to what do you want to do, to empowering peers in business groups to accelerate innovation. And this is actually a great career opportunity for many IT professionals. It's about having a more direct impact in the way, in the growth and in the opportunity to drive the business model of your organization. So a couple of ideas that come to mind when we think about identity is about the first one is about establishing trust. Trust is a crucial driver of modern day employee and customer expectations. In fact, we know there are many studies out there that suggest that, for instance, one of them from Forbes suggests that 80% of consumers, say they will stop engaging with a company altogether if the company had experienced a data breach, for example, exposing their organization. And 50% of US employees would actually leave a company out of frustration with the technology that is provided to them to get their jobs done. The second opportunity here, or the second idea in the context of customer-centric experiences, is deliver a consistent experience across any platform. We saw this in the experience from the Experian example. Providing one consistent technology foundation enables the organization to build out and roll out digital experiences with the greatest return on investment possible, whether your employees or your customers are interacting with your organization on any platform, on a desktop, on a mobile device, on some IoT devices as well. And also the concept of monetizing with identity. Identity is complex and is often equated to cost reductions or IT efficiency. But the reality is that companies who truly utilize identity as the foundation for their overall organizational strategy are able to see how they use identity in a differentiator, in a different and revenue-generating way. If you think about customizing digital experiences to the people that you're optimizing for, whether that's your employees or your customers, being able to deliver that tailored and customized experience based on who they are can be actually pretty impactful, and it can help you get engagement and retention from your employees and your customers. So a good real life example of a company that is using identity to drive digital experiences is Takeda. I'm trying to switch to the next slide, but the clicker is not responding. Maybe somebody can help. Here it is. Takeda is a top 10 pharmaceutical company in the world. It's based in Japan. And they're also one of the oldest, founded almost 240 years ago. Their business model was traditionally used to deal with doctors, when they need inventory inventory for their clinics. But they saw an opportunity to shift focus to direct engagements with patients, healthcare providers, and caregivers. Because of the nature of Takeda's business, the brand is heavily based on trust and reputation, and these are core to the company values. Takeda really prioritizes trust among their customers and employees, and they are using identity to really reimagine the concept of trust with their stakeholders. So Takeda built a single customer digital identity strategy called Takeda ID, which is a strategic component in the technology backbone of the organization that can be shared and interacted with patients, payers, insurance companies, healthcare providers, via any device, mobile, desktop, even IoT, wearables, you name it. And even it's being interacted with by their internal product and R&D departments, with the goal of providing an experience in the line to what customers use when they interact with other digital services in their daily lives, to the customer, to really be able to meet the rising expectations of their customers. So these are just three opportunity areas and insights about how identity can be a change agent, how thinking differently about identity can help us identify opportunities for driving change in our organizations. As IT leaders or owners of the identity strategy in our organization, we can really reimagine the role that identity can play for our organization and use that as a step number one to become those change agents that our organizations need us to be. Some just example of many of other customers, many other identity first companies, as we call them, are, if somebody can help me click to the next slide, you can see them in this slide here, just an example of how many companies are already taking the leap to an identity first mindset for IT. And with that, moving us to the next slide, it's just time. We have roughly just 5 minutes left, but I wanted to open it up for Q&A. Carmen is still around, and excited to answer some of the questions that have come up through the Q&A tool here. So let me just take a look at those. Carmen, I think the first one is for you, and this is actually a pretty interesting question. It's about IT practices. Did using new IT practices actually improve the CIA's performance? Back when you were there, could you help us with that question?
So the answer is yes, but we didn't really understand it until we had a crisis. And it was very fortuitous that we had begun doing the work to deliver content more quickly and digitally when 9/11 happened. So 9/11 happens, and they were very primitive, but we had the platforms ready to go. And as a result, we performed much better than we would have.
Amazing. That's really interesting to hear. There's another really good question, from Stuart. He says, Carmen, thank you for an insightful presentation. You've caused me to reconsider how I view some things. What were the key indicators that you needed to change your approach when trying to advance your ideas, and how did you do it?
Yeah, the presentation makes me sound perhaps a lot smarter than I really am or was or ever will be. So a lot of what I presented, I learned in hindsight or like contemplating my career. But real tell, though, was when, as I mentioned briefly, people started describing me as cynical and negative, and I couldn't get anybody to pay attention to my ideas. Like, really, that tells you that you're doing something wrong. So, a key indicator is a failure. But I will tell you that the most powerful thing I did in terms of IT initiatives at CIA was to greenlight Intellipedia. You can look it up, Google, and see what it was. And really all I did there was just say yes to somebody else's ideas. And that was a very powerful lesson for me, that if you just create an environment where people feel they can pitch you their crazy ideas, some good things will happen.
Definitely. I could not agree with that more. We have roughly 2 minutes left. I'll go through one more question. This one I can take myself. How can I use identity to drive change in my organization? And I think the concept is pretty simple. Many forces, probably internally in our organizations, but also externally from the outside, are pushing this mindset switch, in IT professionals to think about people first rather than technology first. We used to come from a world where we were deployed technology that people have to learn how to use and adapt to it in order to get their jobs done. If you start to think about people being the ultimate beneficials of the ultimate audience that you're actually here to help, to serve, and their needs. And if you start thinking about, if you start using that notion to think about how can I actually deliver experiences and deliver the technology that the people need in order, in context of who they are and what they need, that will immediately bring you back to identity. And if you go through that, foundational mental shift, you'll probably start thinking about, how identity can be leveraged in many different ways to drive change in your organization. So I encourage you to do that and to think about that a little bit more in your own time. With that, we are almost at time. So
Let me just, Lance, if I could just remind, I know that I co-wrote a book about my experiences as a change agent at CIA. It's called Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. And those will be sent out to people who've decided they want to receive them in the next week or two, I understand.
That's awesome. Thank you for the reminder, Carmen. And for the rest of the questions that we didn't get to answer, we'll follow up offline. I want to take just this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us, and special thanks to Carmen for walking us through her incredible life experiences at CIA. Thank you so much, Carmen, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.